January 17, 1940. Berlin. The Reich Air Ministry. The winter light slants through tall windows, casting long shadows across polished Mahler tables. Cigar smoke curls upward in lazy spirals. In this room, where maps of Europe hang like hunting trophies, a group of Luftwaffe generals gather around intelligence photographs, grainy images of an American aircraft, all metal and ambition, its silver fuselage gleaming even in black and white. They pass the photos between manicured fingers and someone laughs. Is not a nervous laugh. Is the laugh of men who have never known defeat, who have seen Polish cavalry charge their tanks and French defenses crumble in weeks. One general is chest-heavy with iron crosses earned in the previous war, holds up the photograph of the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, and speaks the words that will echo through history with bitter irony. The Americans build bombers like they build automobiles, heavy, slow, and in great numbers. But they have never faced the Messerschmitt. The room murmurs its agreement. Outside, Berlin bustles with the confidence of a nation that believes itself invincible. No one in that room, on that cold January morning, understands that they are staring at the instrument of their own ruin. The mockery was not born of ignorance alone. It grew from a soil of genuine accomplishment. The Luftwaffe had written the manual on modern aerial warfare. In Spain, during the Civil War, they had tested their tactics and terror. Guernica had burned under their wings. In Poland, their Stukas had screamed from the sky, their sirens designed to freeze the blood of those below. Blitzkrieg was not merely a word, it was a symphony of armor and air power, conducted with Prussian precision. France, the great military power that had bled Germany white in the trenches of the previous war, had fallen in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. The Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt Bf 109 was the finest fighter aircraft in the world, nimble and deadly. Their pilots wore the arrogance of skill earned in combat. When they looked at the B-17 specifications, a 4-engine bomber designed for high-altitude strategic bombing, they saw only targets. Heavy, lumbering targets. The Boeing B-17 was indeed heavy. 70,000 pounds fully loaded. It carried a crew of 10 men and could, in theory, deliver 4,000 pounds of bombs to targets deep in enemy territory. But theory and practice in warfare are separated by an ocean of blood. The American doctrine of strategic bombing rested on a premise that seemed almost naive to veteran German commanders, that heavily armed bombers, flying in tight formation, could defend themselves against fighter attack and reach their targets in daylight. Daylight. The British had already learned this lesson in blood. By late 1940, RAF Bomber Command had abandoned daylight raids over Germany, their losses unbearable. They bombed by night, accepting reduced accuracy as the price of survival. And here were the Americans, newcomers to the European war, insisting they could succeed where the British had failed. In the officer clubs of the Luftwaffe, from Berlin to occupied Paris, the American bomber became a source of amusement. German pilots, hardened by combat over England during the Battle of Britain, exchanged stories and calculations. The B-17 cruised at perhaps 180 miles per hour when laden with bombs. A Messerschmitt could reach 350. The bomber could climb to 35,000 feet, yes, but slowly, so slowly. A fighter could dance around it, choosing its angle of attack like a matador selecting the moment to strike. The Americans called it the Flying Fortress, boasted of its 13 machine guns, but what good were machine guns fired by frightened men against pilots who had shot down Spitfires over the channel? There was a particular kind of contempt in these assessments. Not the hot hatred reserved for enemies, but the cold dismissal reserved for amateurs who dare to enter a professional's domain. The confidence was not entirely unfounded. When the first American heavy bombers arrived in England in 1942, they came with much fanfare and little experience. The 8th Air Force was new, its crews fresh-faced and trained over the wide skies of Texas and Arizona, where no one shot back. Their early missions were tentative, raids against targets in occupied France, close enough that fighter escorts could accompany them most of the way. Even then, the losses stung. A bomber crew had to complete 25 missions to finish their tour. The odds of survival in those early days were computed and recomputed. The numbers were not comforting. Every man who climbed into a B-17 knew that the laws of probability were not on his side. Yet they climbed in anyway at dawn in the cold English morning, their breath misting in the unheated aircraft, carrying their fear like extra cargo. But something was happening that the German generals, secure in their winter headquarters, did not yet fully comprehend. American industry was awakening. The same production capacity that had flooded the world with automobiles and radios and washing machines was turning toward war with a methodical fury that had no precedent in human history. In 1940, American aircraft production numbered in the hundreds. By 1942, it was thousands. By 1944, it would be tens of thousands. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant alone produced one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes at peak production. Boeing's factories in Seattle worked around the clock. The skies over America's industrial heartland were busy with test flights, with training runs, with the systematic preparation for a campaign of aerial destruction that would dwarf everything that had come before. The German generals had expected scarcity. They understood scarcity. It was the German condition. Every aircraft, every gallon of fuel, every trained pilot was precious and carefully rationed. The Eastern Front devoured men and machines at a rate that made replacement difficult. When a Luftwaffe squadron lost 6 aircraft in combat, it was a serious blow. The Americans lost 6 aircraft and shrugged. They lost 60 and built more. This was not the warfare the Germans knew. This was industrial warfare waged not primarily by courage or skill, though both were present, but by the simple mathematics of production. How do you defeat an enemy who can afford to learn through failure, who treats aircraft as consumable items, who measures losses not in individual tragedies, but in statistical aggregates? August 17, 1943. The air tastes of oil and anxiety at Thorpe Abbott's airfield in Norfolk. It is barely dawn, but the men of the 100th Bomb Group are already awake, moving through the rituals that might keep them alive for another day. They have been briefed on today's target, Regensburg, deep in southern Germany, where Messerschmitt fighters are manufactured, and Schweinfurt, center of Germany's ball-bearing industry. A double strike ambitious in its scope, requiring the bombers to fly hundreds of miles beyond the range of fighter escort into the heart of German air defenses. The men know what this means. Some write letters they hope will never be mailed. Some joke with brittle humor. Some are silent, locked inside themselves. The B-17s stand in rows on the hard stand, their aluminum skin beaded with morning dew. Each aircraft carries a name painted on its nose: Memphis Belle, Hells Angels, Yankee Doodle, as if christening them might somehow offer protection. The names are brave and cocky. The faces of the men climbing into them are young. They take off in sequence, one bomber after another, the thunder of engines rolling across the English countryside. They form up over the channel, circling, climbing, assembling into the combat box formation that is meant to concentrate their defensive firepower. From the ground, it is magnificent. Hundreds of aircraft catching the early sun, contrails streaming behind them, the roar audible for miles. From inside the bombers is cramped and cold. At altitude, the temperature drops to 40 below zero. The men wear heated suits that often fail. They breathe through oxygen masks that frost over. The plexiglass of the nose and waist positions offers a view of empty sky and distant Europe, growing closer with each passing minute. The German radar stations pick them up over the coast. The information flows through military circuits with practiced efficiency. Fighter squadrons scramble from a dozen airfields. Today, the Luftwaffe will marshal nearly every fighter it can get airborne. The German pilots are veterans now of a different kind than those who mocked the B-17 in 1940. These are men who have fought on 3 fronts, who have seen friends burn and fall, who understand that the war is no longer the easy conquest it once seemed. But they are still skilled, still dangerous, and today they have numbers. Nearly 300 German fighters rise to meet the American formation. The attacks begin over Belgium. They come from the sun, diving fast, their cannon hammering. The Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs have learned to attack from head-on, where the bombers' defensive fire is weakest, closing at a combined speed of 500 miles per hour, firing, breaking away, climbing to attack again. Inside the B-17s, the gunners swivel their turrets, trying to track targets that flash past in seconds. The .50 caliber machine guns hammer, their noise deafening even through leather helmets. Hot brass casings spray through the interior. The smell of gunpowder and hydraulic fluid and fear mingles in the thin air. An aircraft in the formation takes a hit in the No. 2 engine. It catches fire, and the fire spreads, fed by oxygen and fuel, until the entire wing is burning. The plane falls out of formation, spiraling down. Perhaps some of the crew bails out. Perhaps they do not. There is no time to watch. There are still hours of flying ahead, hours of combat, and the German fighters are coming back for another pass. At Regensburg, the bombs fall. The Norden bombsight, that marvel of American engineering, allows for unprecedented accuracy from high altitude, in theory. In practice, with flak bursting around them, with fighters attacking, with the aircraft bouncing in the turbulence of exploding shells, accuracy is relative. But the bombs fall in great clusters, tumbling down, and where they strike, factories explode, workshops collapse, assembly lines designed to produce the very fighters that are attacking them are torn apart. The destruction is immense. It is also insufficient. War production is dispersed, redundant, adaptable. What is destroyed today will be relocated tomorrow, rebuilt within weeks. But the Americans do not know this yet. They have done their job. They turn for home. The formations are scattered now, broken by combat. Individual bombers struggle to catch up with the group, seeking the safety of numbers. Stragglers are targeted by German fighters who have learned to cull the weak from the herd. One B-17, its controls damaged, falls behind. The fighters swarm it like sharks drawn to blood in the water. The bombers' guns fire until they run out of ammunition, and then they fire no more. The aircraft absorbs hit after hit, its aluminum skin punctured by hundreds of holes, until something vital is struck, fuel tank, pilot, control cable, and it simply comes apart in the air, breaking into pieces that tumble toward the green earth below. The survivors limp back to England. Some land at the first airfield they can find, too damaged to make it to their home base. Some crash on the runway, their landing gear shot away, skidding in showers of sparks. Some land with dead and wounded aboard, with hydraulic fluid and blood pooling on the deck, with engines that quit immediately after touchdown. The ground crews count the returning bombers with sinking hearts. 60 aircraft lost. 600 men missing, dead, or captured in a single day. The highest losses yet sustained by the 8th Air Force in a single mission. In the debriefing rooms, exhausted crews speak in halting voices, reliving what they have seen. The intelligence officers take notes. The numbers are compiled. The cost of the raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg is calculated with grim precision. In Berlin, there is satisfaction. The reports from the front are encouraging. The Americans have been bloodied. Their vaunted flying fortresses have been shot from the sky in numbers that make continuation of such raids seem impossible. Surely, the Germans reason the Americans will learn as the British learned. They will abandon daylight raids. They will accept that strategic bombing of the Reich is too costly to sustain. The propaganda machinery trumpets the victory. German newsreels show burning bombers, captured aircrews, the wreckage scattered across the countryside. The numbers speak for themselves. 60 aircraft lost means 600 American airmen removed from the war. At such a rate, the Americans cannot continue. Mathematics will defeat them, even if German fighters do not. But the mathematics the Germans are calculating is incomplete. They count the losses and project them forward, assuming that American production is finite, that American resolve is brittle, that any rational enemy would recognize the unsustainability of such casualties. They are wrong on all counts. In the United States, the factories are building replacement bombers faster than they can be destroyed. The training schools are graduating new crews faster than they can be killed. And most crucially, the Americans are learning. Every mission provides data. Every loss is analyzed. The tactics evolve with each sortie. The combat box formation is refined to maximize defensive fire. The bombers begin to fly higher, faster, tighter. Fighter escorts are extended in range by adding drop tanks, auxiliary fuel tanks that can be jettisoned when empty. The P-47 Thunderbolt, armed with 8.50 caliber machine guns, begins to appear in greater numbers. And in the development hangars, a new fighter is being prepared, one that will change the equation completely. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter capable of escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The German generals, looking at their intelligence reports in late 1943, should have seen the pattern. The American raids are not decreasing. Despite the losses, despite the bloodshed, the bombers keep coming. After Schweinfurt, there is a pause, but it is a pause to build strength, not a retreat. When the raids resume in early 1944, the formations are larger. The escorts are more numerous, and the tactics are deadlier. The Luftwaffe pilots, who once attacked with confidence, now find themselves fighting not just bombers but American fighters that seek them out, that challenge them for control of their own skies. The hunted have become hunters. The Messerschmitts that once dove on bomber formations without fear now check their tails constantly, knowing that a Mustang might be waiting there. By spring of 1944, the sky over Germany is filled with American aircraft. Not dozens, not scores, hundreds, sometimes more than 1,000 bombers in a single day, accompanied by hundreds of fighters. The Luftwaffe scrambles everything that can fly to oppose them. German pilots fly 3 for missions in a single day, landing only to refuel and rearm, climbing back into the cockpit exhausted, knowing that the odds are turning against them. Fuel is becoming scarce. Experienced pilots are being killed faster than replacements can be trained. The new pilots rush through abbreviated training programs, last days in combat, sometimes hours. The sky has become a killing ground, and increasingly it is German aircraft that are falling. The German generals are no longer laughing. In their headquarters, now often located underground to escape the bombing, they confront a reality that their earlier arrogance made unthinkable. The Americans have not been deterred. The flying fortresses, which were supposed to be easy targets, have become instruments of systematic destruction. The factories that produce tanks are bombed. The refineries that produce fuel are bombed. The rail yards that transport supplies are bombed. The cities themselves are bombed, with a fury that makes mockery of the German attacks on London. Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin, each burns in turn. The tonnage of bombs dropped by American and British aircraft on Germany in 1940 far exceeds everything dropped in all previous years combined. The B-17, that aircraft they had once dismissed, has become synonymous with a new kind of total warfare. There is a recording, made late in the war, of a German fighter pilot being interviewed. He is young, they are all young by this point, the veterans mostly dead, and his voice carries a tremor that might be exhaustion or fear or both. He describes what it is like to approach an American bomber formation. The sky, he says, turns black with flak from the ground defenses. The bombers themselves fill the air with tracers from their guns. The American fighters circle above, waiting. You must fly through all of it, he says, to reach the bombers. And even if you succeed, even if you shoot down 1 or 2, there are always more. Always more. They do not stop coming. The interviewer asks him if he believes Germany can win. There is a long pause. Then he says simply, I do not know how we can fight against the sky itself. The sky itself. This is what the B-17 had become, not merely an aircraft, but manifestation of American industrial power, a symbol of the terrible arithmetic of total war. Each bomber represented thousands of hours of labor, tons of aluminum, miles of wire, gallons of hydraulic fluid, the work of riveters and welders and inspectors and test pilots. Each bomber carried bombs that represented steel and TNT and fuses, produced in vast quantities. Each mission required fuel refined from oil, oxygen compressed into tanks, ammunition manufactured by the millions of rounds. The logistics of keeping 1,000 bombers in the air over Germany was staggering, and the Americans made it routine. They made it routine because they could, because behind the bombers were the factories, and behind the factories was a continent untouched by war, where workers punched time clocks and earned wages, and went home to houses with electricity and refrigerators and radios that broadcast news of victory. The German soldiers who were captured after the Normandy invasion, who were transported back to the United States to prisoner of war camps, experienced a shock that their commanders had never prepared them for. They traveled through an American landscape utterly untouched by war. Cities with every light burning. Highways crowded with private automobiles. Stores full of goods. Civilians who seemed not to know what rationing meant. The prisoners were fed better in the camps than they had been fed in their own army. One prisoner interviewed after the war recalled thinking that Germany had been fighting not a nation but a different planet, one where abundance was so natural that it could be extended even to enemies. The symbolic power of this abundance was devastating. These men had been told that Germany was winning, that the Allies were on the verge of collapse. Then they saw America, and they understood that they had been lied to. No nation that could afford to feed its prisoners so well was on the verge of anything but victory. The B-17 was the aerial manifestation of that abundance. It was not the best bomber in the world by every metric. The British Lancaster could carry more bombs. The later B-29 could fly higher and faster. But the B-17 was produced in quantities that made individual excellence less important than collective impact. Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed built 12,731 Flying Fortresses between 1935 and 1945. 12,000 aircraft. Each loss was felt by the families of the men aboard, each empty bunk in the barracks a small tragedy, but strategically the losses were acceptable because they could be replaced. This was warfare as industrial process, where victory went not to the most courageous or skilled, but to the side that could produce more, endure more, replace more. The transformation of the war in the air was mirrored by a transformation in those who fought it. The American bomber crews who flew the early missions were volunteers, men who believed in the righteousness of their cause, but also in their own survival. By 1944, they were draftees, men who flew because they were ordered to, who understood that their chances were poor, but climbed into the bombers anyway, because to refuse was unthinkable. They developed a fatalism that was almost philosophical. You did your job. You flew your missions. If you survived, you counted it as luck, not skill. Many did not survive. The casualty rates in the 8th Air Force were higher than in any other branch of the American military, except the Marine Infantry in the Pacific. 1 in 4 airmen who flew combat missions over Europe was killed. 1 in 4. They were aware of the statistics. They saw the empty bunks. They attended the memorial services for crews that did not return. And yet they kept flying. This was not simply courage. It was something deeper and more complex. It was the internalization of the idea that individual survival was less important than collective victory, that their lives were part of a larger equation that led to the defeat of fascism. The Germans, who valued martial courage, could not understand this. To them, courage was personal, a matter of individual honor and glory. The American approach seemed mechanical, impersonal, almost inhuman in its willingness to accept loss. But it was devastatingly effective. April 11, 1945. The war is in its final weeks. The German lines are collapsing on all fronts. The Red Army is closing on Berlin from the east. The Western Allies have crossed the Rhine. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe's skies, is reduced to scattered remnants. There is no fuel to fly regular missions. The experienced pilots are dead or captured. The aircraft factories are ruins. And still, the American bombers come. Today's target is an airfield near Munich, a final mission against an enemy that can barely fight back. The formation flies without significant opposition. The bombs fall. The airfield is destroyed. It is a footnote to the war, this mission, barely worth mentioning in the histories. In the rubble of Berlin, German officers burn documents and contemplate surrender or suicide. Some of them are the same men who, in 1940, had laughed at photographs of the B-17. If they remember that laughter now, it must taste of ashes. The sky above them, when they dare to look up, is empty of German aircraft. It belongs to the Allies. The great gamble of strategic bombing has succeeded, not because of any single mission, not because of tactical brilliance, but because of remorseless, systematic application of overwhelming force. The Americans had taken the concept of the bomber offensive and industrialized it, turned it into a production line of destruction that ground down German capacity to wage war. The symbolism of the B-17 extended beyond its immediate military function. It became, in the eyes of both allies and enemies, representative of the American way of war and, by extension, the American system itself. Democracy, the argument went, could produce more than tyranny. Free labor was more productive than slave labor. An economy based on consumer abundance could, when necessary, redirect that abundance toward military ends with results that authoritarian regimes could not match. The Flying Fortress was proof of concept, a 10-man crew inside a machine that cost the equivalent of 60 houses, flown on missions that might destroy it on the first sortie, and behind it 100 more being built. This was capitalism at total war, and it was terrible to behold. The German generals who had mocked the Americans learned their lesson too late. By the time they understood what they faced, they lacked the resources to counter it. Their own industry, never as robust as their propaganda claimed, was hamstrung by divided commands, competing priorities, and the increasing need to disperse production to avoid bombing. They could not match American production in 1942. By 1944, the gap had widened to the point where comparison was meaningless. Germany produced 40,000 aircraft in 1944, a remarkable achievement under the circumstances. The United States produced 96,000. The numbers tell the story better than any narrative. When the war ended, thousands of B-17s were declared surplus. Some were sold for scrap, their aluminum melted down and repurposed. Some were converted to civilian use, serving as cargo and passenger aircraft in the late 1940s. Some were simply abandoned at airfields around the world, left to rust and decay. Their usefulness ended with the war. A few were preserved in museums, polished monuments to the men who flew them. Visitors today can walk through these preserved aircraft, can sit in the pilot's seat, can peer through the plexiglass of the bombardier's position. The spaces are cramped. The metal is cold to the touch. It takes imagination to populate these empty shells with young men, to hear the thunder of engines, to feel the aircraft shudder under the impact of flak. In Germany, there are few monuments to the Luftwaffe. The bomber offensive destroyed too much, killed too many civilians, left too many scars for glorification. The skeletal remains of factories, the empty lots where neighborhoods once stood, the archived photographs of cities reduced to rubble, these are the monuments to what strategic bombing achieved. The B-17 and its kin did not win the war alone. The Red Army bore the brunt of combat against the Wehrmacht. The invasion of Normandy required the courage of infantry and the skill of planners. The war in the Pacific was its own nightmare of blood and distance. But the bomber offensive broke the back of German industry, destroyed the Luftwaffe, and made the final victory possible. There is a final image worth considering. Somewhere in the archives is a photograph taken over Germany in 1944. It shows from the waist gun position of a B-17 another bomber flying in formation. The sky around them is streaked with contrails. Below, the earth is obscured by clouds. The photograph is mundane, thousands like it exist. But it captures something essential. The bomber is just one of many, part of a formation which is part of a mission, which is part of a campaign, which is part of a war effort that spanned a continent and mobilized a nation. The individual aircraft is insignificant. The collective force is overwhelming. The generals who mocked the Flying Fortress in 1940 were not fools. They were making assessments based on the information available, on their understanding of warfare, on their experience of what was possible. They could not imagine what American industry would become once fully mobilized. They could not conceive of a nation that would build tens of thousands of heavy bombers and fill them with young men willing to fly into the teeth of defended airspace, mission after mission, accepting losses that would have broken smaller nations. They could not imagine it because nothing in their experience prepared them for it. But the bombers came anyway. They darkened the sky over Europe, as the title promises, but more than that, they represented a darkness of a different kind, the shadow cast by a power so vast and so committed that opposition became not just difficult, but impossible. The laughter in that Berlin conference room in 1940 died somewhere over the Ruhr Valley, or above Schweinfurt, or in the smoke of burning refineries. It died in the realization that they had underestimated not just a weapon, but a system, a philosophy, an entire way of organizing human effort toward a goal. War reveals truths that peace obscures. One of those truths is that abundance, properly directed, is a weapon as devastating as any bomb. The B-17 was a delivery system for high explosives, yes, but it was also a delivery system for a message that the United States could afford to build them by the thousands, to fly them through walls of fire, to lose them and build more, until the enemy simply ran out of ammunition, out of fuel, out of pilots, out of hope. The German generals mocked the Flying Fortress until they could not mock it anymore, until it became the symbol of their defeat, until the drone of its engines became the soundtrack to the collapse of their 1,000-year Reich that lasted only 12 years. In the end, the story of the B-17 over Europe is not just about aircraft or tactics or even casualties. It is about the collision between two worldviews, one that believed in the supremacy of martial spirit and military genius, the other that believed in industrial capacity and democratic mobilization. The skies over Europe were the testing ground, and the test was conclusive. The Flying Fortress, that aircraft which seemed so easy to mock in 1940, proved to be the instrument that wrote the final verdict of the war in contrails and craters, in production figures and casualty lists, in the systematic destruction of the capacity to make war. The generals learned their lesson. The sky taught it to them, one bomber at a time, until the lessons blotted out the sun.